In a writing class I took a few years ago, someone described reading fantasy as chewing through leather. And while I don't necessarily totally agree with the sentiment, I feel like it's applicable here. Part of the appeal of the fantasy and sci-fi genres is that the reader knows that the entire world is going to be original from the ground up. A fantasy writer often can't rely on pre-existing settings and locations for their worlds to take place in. While established tropes do help, nearly everything in a fantasy world, from the world's various cultures, class dynamics, politics, natural environments and ecosystems, architecture, and a million other bits of information, have to be totally invented. Because of this, a major draw for the fantasy and sci-fi genres is the fact that the reader knows that they will be following the story of an entire world, filled with many interconnecting pieces, and not just a select few characters. So, having a reader get into a fantasy story requires the world building to be very creative and intriguing, and then for that world building to be delivered in a way that isn't too burdensome. Otherwise, all that is happening is the reader would just be subjected to slogging through an endless sea of boring, bland, expository schmuck just to experience the story part. And that's probably the most commendable part of this film. If anything, Dune does an excellent job at avoiding this problem. The world of Dune is genuinely fascinating, and I enjoyed learning as much about it as I did. The power dynamics between the cold and brutal Harkonnens and House Atreides under the rule and influence of an invisible emperor, a box that induces pain which is used as a test of character, a body shield that blocks only fast projectiles, which forces soldiers to engage in an antiquated form of combat, massive worms that consume everything that moves along the desert, and the indigenous people that walk in a deliberate pattern to go unnoticed by them. A small mouse that has big ears to collect moisture so it can survive the unforgiving heat of Arrakis. All of these elements make the world of Dune feel alive, and have me invested in what happens there. I also found it impressive just how much of this was either conveyed visually or simply implied. While there is some expository dialogue, most of the conversations between characters are character-focused first. My favorite aspect of Dune was its vision of human civilization in the far future. The designs of the uniforms and characters' outfits, the spacecraft and ships, the cities and their militaries, and armor and weapons all felt so foreign while still remaining somewhat familiar. This is why, despite Dune being set on a desert planet in a space opera, it feels very distinct from something like Star Wars, which isn't meant to relate to our world at all. So it embraces a pure fantasy while Dune is more grounded and realistic. Something I enjoyed nearly as much as the world building was the sound design. I feel like a lot of mainstream movies nowadays really underutilize sound. So this film was really refreshing. I can't necessarily explain it, but the way the sound is used in this movie is reminiscent of watching something like a Stanley Kubrick film, such as 2001: A Space Odyssey. In fact, Dune has a slow, enchanting quality to its pacing and cinematography that feels very inspired from 2001. That being said, I wasn't particularly impressed by the soundtrack. While there are some interesting choices, such as the bagpipes during the Harkonnen raid scene, I feel like on the whole, it was pretty average from Hans Zimmer and uninspired. Just my opinion, don't kill me for it. What wasn't uninspired, however, were the practical sets and in-camera effects that did a lot to sell this movie's authenticity. While there certainly are a lot of CG elements in cleanup, and those elements are certainly very strong, you can tell that many of the set pieces are actually there. Having practical, real sets is very important, especially for sci-fi and fantasy films, because it allows the actors to interact and maneuver around their environment in a way that isn't possible if they're simply standing in front of a green screen, such as the case of basically every MCU film. Don't kill me for that opinion either. So the world building and filmmaking of Dune is great. The real weakness of this movie, then, is with the story, and to a small degree, the characters. It's just so hard to get invested in people who display very little emotion. Nearly all of the characters speak in hushed tones or in lengthy proverbs and parables. I know it was a deliberate decision to make the characters appear solemn all the time, and that was done to make them seem less familiar to us and also sell them as being royalty. But, it just wasn't easy to get invested into them. Now that I've seen the whole movie, in retrospect, I really appreciate Paul's father, the Duke of Atreides. He was really cool as he was in a position of immense power, but you could tell that he was a genuinely good person who was also selfless and valued the lives of his people and cared about his son. Baron Harkonnen, the villain of this movie, is also ridiculously cool. With his large size and his overwhelming presence and the way he just slithers into the air. I also just love how silly his schemes are. He will just flat out lie to people, but he'll word his lies in such a way that he can't be accused of lying because for some reason he really cares about that. So the specific phrasing of his statements is literally all that matters to him. So I just thought that was so interesting. And there are some other minor characters that are pretty memorable, such as Duncan Idaho and Jessica. Duncan Idaho was probably the best dude in the whole thing, honestly. I just love his name that much. At the moment, the biggest weakness I see in Dune is with Paul. Not that the actor did a poor job with the performance. No, in fact, Timothy Chalamet's depiction of the character is great. The problem was that it was just kind of generic. Under the surface of this vast sea of great lore and history, we get a kind of familiar coming-of-age story. And I think this is because the movie doesn't cover enough ground. We get hints that Paul Atreides is not necessarily going to be a great hero. He has visions of becoming a sort of ruler that's preceded by the image of a mountain of dead, burnt bodies, which means he will literally climb a mountain of dead bodies to ascend to power. That ain't good, but so far that arc is mostly just foreshadowed and not necessarily stated. And also, I'm not much of a fan of the Chosen One narrative. Honestly, just making this review has made me realize how much Star Wars has borrowed from Dune. Pretty much all of the ideas in this story were used in Star Wars in some way. Kind of interesting, I guess. I think my favorite moment with Paul was his duel with the Fremen Janus, and it ends with Paul taking his first life. It was significant because Paul had visions of being friends and learning about Arrakis from Janus as a sort of possible future that never happened. But how it actually played out was with Paul killing him, and in an odd twist of fate, Paul still learned something important from Janus. Despite knowing him for a short time, he still taught him an important lesson, as his vision foretold. So yeah, those are my confused and jumbled opinions on Dune, and the sci-fi fantasy genres as a whole. I liked it, but at the moment, I'm not really desperate for more. This is compounded by the fact that apparently the people over at Warner Brothers who produced this film didn't greenlight a sequel until this film came out because they were waiting to see if it would succeed. Which I don't know why they were thinking it wouldn't, which has resulted in the next movie having a release date in 2023, which is about a decade from now in today's world. I don't feel like getting too invested in a story if I have to wait 2 years before the next installment. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. See ya.